2 months ago, the Allied landings at Gallipoli were supposed to easily defeat the Ottomans and turn the tide of the war. This turned out to be total fantasy, and the fighting there soon descended into trench warfare and stalemate. But the Allies wouldn't call it off, and this week they tried something new. I'm Indy Neidell. This is The Great War. Last week, we took a look at the chaos at home in Russia that was being caused by their recent losses in the field. And they were many. For 2 months, Austro-German forces had pushed them relentlessly back in the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, and last week had retaken Lemberg, the capital of Austrian Galicia. The Austro-Hungarian army had also held its ground in the south, as the Italians made their first major attack of the war. I did not talk about either the Western Front or Gallipoli last week, so that's what I'm going to start off with today. British General Aylmer Hunter-Weston and his French counterpart Henri Gouraud at Gallipoli decided to stop making general advances and instead concentrate all artillery to support localized attacks, biting off a small chunk of the Turkish lines and then basically creating a wall of shells to help hold off the counterattacks. The French tried this out first. On June 21st, they launched an attack on a narrow front of around 600 meters to take the Turkish trenches. They were supported by so many 75mm guns, howitzers, trench mortars, and British howitzers that it worked out to one gun or howitzer for every 10 meters of the assault. They also had batteries of guns firing on the rest of the Turkish lines to prevent support, and long-range batteries hammering at the Turkish guns on the Asian side of the Dardanelles. The trenches were close, so there was little margin for error. After a final bombardment of 45 minutes, the French charged at 6 a.m. By mid-afternoon, they had taken several of their targets and then threw back the first counterattacks. But the problem with taking the Turkish front lines in many cases was that trenches had basically been destroyed by artillery and were choked with corpses, so there was no shelter. The French were driven back, but came on again and were ultimately successful. They had captured Haricot Redoubt, taking 2,500 casualties and inflicting nearly 6,000. It was the British turn on the 28th at Gully Spear and Gully Ravine. They would be supported with 77 guns and howitzers, and during the battle, fired over 16,000 shells, nearly half the total British supply at Cape Helles. The advance began after 2 days of bombardment, the Gurkha Rifles and Royal Fusiliers making rapid headway. Other troops, particularly the Scottish Rifles, were not so fortunate and were massacred by the Turkish machine guns. The Turkish counterattacks went on for days. In Peter Hart's words, careless of casualties, careless of anything. And for the week of the battle, the Turks themselves estimated their losses at 14,000 men, several times that of the attackers. As the counterattacks were called off, the lines stabilized. The Ottoman forces were worried about the partial success of the attackers, but they showed no signs of giving up and still held the most important high ground positions. One thing, the ground in front of the British trenches was covered with a huge amount of rotting Turkish corpses. They would remain there for the rest of the campaign. Hunter-Weston refused the Turkish requests for a truce for mass burials. The British command thought the Turks would be less willing to attack over a no-man's land filled with their own side's corpses. Seriously. Another note from Gallipoli, on June 28th, 10 days after the arrival of a fresh Turkish regiment, Mustafa Kemal was confident he could drive the Anzac forces, the Australians and New Zealanders, off of Chunuk Bair and into the sea. He led the attack, which was a failure, and his new regiment was wiped out. He offered his resignation, but was persuaded by German General Liman von Sanders to remain, since his courage was now legendary and a very real inspiration to his men in both victory and defeat. Another one of the big figures of the war was also active this week, on the Western Front. German Crown Prince Wilhelm led his army to the attack in the Argonne on June 26. The battle was fierce and would last for a whole week, with Wilhelm's forces eventually unable to break the French lines. But one place the Germans were not being held back was on the Eastern Front. The Russians continued to retreat throughout the week, as the Austro-German forces turned north and advanced between the Vistula and Bug rivers. Heavy fighting would develop between those rivers as the week ended, but still, the German colossus came on and on. Earlier in June, Kaiser Wilhelm, German Army Chief of Staff Falkenhayn, his Austrian counterpart Konrad von Hotzendorf, and German generals Mackensen and Ludendorff had met at Pless, right? Ludendorff had requested reinforcements for his big plan, which was a big sweep from the Baltic coast southward that would cut off the Russian armies as they retreated eastward and hopefully bring the war in the east to an end. Falkenhayn, though, didn't agree to this. See, he was, like always, concerned with the security of the Western Front, and he wanted to take divisions away from Poland and bring them to France. Conrad, who had taken Italy's entry into the war against Austria as a personal insult, wanted to send troops to the Italian front. Mackensen was for continuing the hugely successful Gorlice-Tarnów offensive, and it was he who got his way, and was promoted to field marshal to boot. But now, a few weeks later, Ludendorff was still pressing the issue of his Baltic strategy. So he met the Kaiser and Falkenhayn again on June 30th at Posen with an even bigger grand plan. This one would take the German forces from the mouth of the river Niemen on the Baltic all the way to the Pripet marshes, right in the center of the whole Eastern Front. Falkenhayn did not, however, agree to Ludendorff's grand plan. He was to be allowed to have a Baltic offensive, but it was to take a backseat to Mackensen's further south. Falkenhayn was determined to not make the same mistake as Napoleon and go too far into Russia's interior. Still, the situation was pretty desperate for the Russians any way you slice it. Their whole front was destabilized, and Russian Poland was seriously vulnerable. While in East Prussia and Galicia, the German and Austro-German forces were running rampant. Finally, Grand Duke Nikolai and the Stavka, the Russian military high command, decided that even though Russia would withdraw from Galicia, she would hold on to Warsaw and Poland. Seems like it would be hard to remain optimistic, and indeed, optimism was failing everywhere. In Mesopotamia, for example, British forces were losing the optimism they had felt after their brilliant victory at Amara a few weeks ago. On June 27th, British and Indian forces attacked the Ottoman garrison at Nasiriyeh, but by this time of year, the heat that had been bearable weeks ago was no longer so. It now reached 45 degrees Celsius, 115 Fahrenheit. There were hordes of mosquitoes, and the Turkish field guns there were firing as reliably as at Gallipoli. Still, the attackers managed to capture the garrison, but it was hard going. The Ottoman forces withdrew and began to prepare new defensive positions at Kut. The British and Indians tried to pursue them, but their forces were decimated by sickness, mostly sunstroke and heat stroke. I read this about a burial in Martin Gilbert's The First World War. Quote, "We started out for the cemetery, about a mile away at 6 p.m. Before we'd gone half the distance, a man went down with heat stroke and was carried back. As the corpse was lowered into the grave, one of the men on the ropes stumbled forward and fell limply into the grave on top of the dead body. And as we fell in to march back, another man went down. We had buried one man and lost 3 others over the job." End quote. And that was the week. The Germans and Austrians on the move in the east, but the Germans going nowhere in the west. The French, British, and Anzac troops all winning their engagements at Gallipoli, and the British successful in Mesopotamia, but falling to the heat. The German-Galician campaign was an exercise in incredible calculation, strategy, and heroism, and it resulted in the total loss of over 1 million lives. Actually, here are some more general numbers. As of July 1st, total German casualties for the year were at 1.7 million, with 306,000 killed and 500,000 permanently disabled. And this week, the number of Frenchmen in arms reached 5 million. How many of them would die? How many would lose limbs or have their eyes burned out by gas? This was a week of new plans and battles by the Germans, and new tactics by the French and the British. But you know what? In reality, it was the same as last week, the same as every week. Thousands upon thousands of dead soldiers. All those soldiers had to live mostly in trenches, at least on the Western Front. At times, they were almost drowning in those when the rains came. Sometimes they had to eat rats. You can find out more about life in the trenches and the logistics behind them in our special episode on trench warfare right here. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Brian Smeets. He and the other Patreons helped us improve our maps and animations. If you want to help us reach the next milestone, check out our Patreon page. You can find more in-depth discussion on our show in our subreddit, which you should definitely check out. See you next time.